Chapter 20, Section 3, The Atlantic Slave Trade. So let's talk a bit about the background of what led towards slavery. So once Europeans gained various territories in the Americas, a lot of the crops, whether it be cotton, be sugar, a lot of these types of crops required intensive labor, which the Europeans were not willing to do. And instead thought that the easiest way to do this would find cheap or free labor through the use of slavery. Now, slavery, as we know from what we've studied at the beginning of the year, has been around for many, many millennia. In fact, slavery really became mainstream around the 7th century when various Muslim nations conquered and enslaved millions of Africans between the 6th to 17th century. And in fact, by the 1600s, 17 million Africans, so about 5 million more than the transatlantic slave trade, had made its way to the Arab Peninsula. So this shows you how it especially skyrockets in the 600s and the 700s. Now part 3 is a little bit controversial. So some texts say that slavery by the Arab Muslim world was quote-unquote a bit more humane in the sense that some of these slaves would go on to attain posts like general and military leader, things that would be impossible for those who were involved in transatlantic slavery. With that said, other sources talk about the castration of African slaves and just the various ways they were abused by the Arab owners. So, what it happened over a thousand years ago is when it started. So, when it comes to the details of these facts, it's a bit unclear, but either way, we know that both the transatlantic slave trade and the Arab slave trade were just horrible events in history that had very negative effect towards Africans. So a reasonable question one could ask is, why Africa? Or why not Asia? Why not those in the Americas? Well, there's several reasons why the Africans were victims to the slave trade. So number one, in comparison to the millions of Native Americans who died from the diseases brought in by the Europeans, Africans had already been exposed to these European diseases, therefore had immunity. 2, Africans had experience in plantation farming, so therefore it was very easy to bring them in, and boom, they're ready to do cotton farming, sugar farming, and whatnot. Number 3, Africans were less likely to escape because they did not know the local land. So again, this is a comparison with the Native Americans, right, who might be able to run away and know exactly where to go. The Africans are transported into this land, they have no idea what's going on. So they were, in that sense, much easier to control. And 4, Africans were easier to catch because of their skin color. So again, this is a comparison to the Native Americans. When we look at the Native Americans, and again, this connects back to encomienda, you had mulattoes, you had mestizos, you had those whose skin color may not have been that different from the Spanish conquistadors. Whereas for the Africans, it was very clear if an African slave had run away that she was there for slavery. And finally, various passages from the Bible, mostly from the Old Testament, whether it be Exodus or Leviticus, had various phrases and quotes that Spanish conquistadors used to legitimize slavery, such as the curse of Ham. So let's talk a bit about this Atlantic slave trade. So what was crazy about this Atlantic slave trade is just the sheer number and brutalities that surround this trade. So during this time period, in a matter of 200 to 300 years, almost 10 million slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas. This was also known as the Middle Passage. So Europeans would come down, and mostly from, as you can see in this map here, Western Africa, take slaves from the western parts of Africa, cross across the Atlantic Ocean, and bring them to various plantations. This was an incredibly, incredibly brutal process. Spain and Portugal had various crops that needed slaves, and therefore they brought many, many slaves from Africa, mostly Western Africa, to the Americas. This was hard, grueling labor. So these conditions the slaves were brought in, it was called the Middle Passage, incredibly, incredibly poor situations, right? They didn't have food, very little food, they were treated very poorly. This Middle Passage was just absolutely a miserable experience. The conditions of the ships that this picture shows you are just incredibly cramped. You can't even move, right? When you need to pee or poo, you defecate in that space you're stuck in. Many, many Africans died even before they got to the Americas. In fact, conditions were so bad that some slaves would just jump overboard, or they would ask others to kill them because they'd rather die than live through these miserable conditions of the Middle Passage. And as I mentioned earlier, there's no sanitation, right? People are just using buckets where they just pee and poo where they are. This also meant more diseases would spread, and people, if they didn't commit suicide or they weren't whipped to death, they might even just die from diseases being stuck on this small little boat. So the way the trades were set up was known as the triangular trade. So this is known as the triangle trade, as you can see the shape is of a triangle, right? You have these various goods, like guns especially, make their way to Africa, and then from Africa the slaves go to the Americas, and then various goods from the Americas make it to Europe. So obviously in this triangle, there's one group that benefits the most, and that's the Europeans, and there's one group that benefits the least, and these are the Africans. So again, a quick review. Africa to America, slaves; Europe to Africa, weapons; and America to Europe, sugar, silk, tobacco, various goods. Now, a reasonable question to all this is, why didn't the Africans fight back? And some did, but a lot were willing to work with the Europeans. And this was because of several reasons. So first, they are forced to oblige by violence. So they just didn't have a choice, right? They were mismatched very much in terms of technology and weapons, and they knew if they fought back, they would just end up being killed. Number two, some of these African leaders looked at this as a business opportunity, that it was still worth selling off their own people if it meant they could make materialistic gains. And three, this might be the most important one, possible militaristic benefits. So if you have a tribe or an empire in Africa and you see another empire or tribe getting various weapons and gunpowder from Europeans, you want to copy them, right? Because you're worried you're going to then be conquered with the weapons that they have. So you're willing now to sell out your own people. Which connects to four, pretty much what I just mentioned, right? There's pressure that other groups are working with Europeans, so you're thinking, all right, we need to work with them too. So the effects and the consequences of the slave trade were just absolutely enormous and negative towards the continent of Africa. Many historians see these as centuries of lost generations where the fittest members of African society were moved away from Africa to various continents. And probably one of the greatest negatives was now Africa is filled with these weapons known as guns, which in fact increase the wars happening in Africa. So Africa is having double, triple, quadruple problems, right? They're losing their men, they have more weapons now within, leaders are betraying their own people in order to trade with Europeans. So the effects of the slave trade were absolutely negative. And this came at a very bad time because the early times of the Atlantic slave trade were the same times of the Arab slave trade. So you have basically slave trade happening, not only slaves going westward towards the Americas, but also northward towards the Arab world. So a good question to ask ourselves today is, what is the current status of slavery? And it may come to people's surprise that there are tens of millions of slaves today. And in fact, some historians would argue that today there are more slaves than ever. These slaves are throughout the world in various countries, including, yes, even the United States of America. And it's a big problem that we all have to take into account. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, blah, blah, blah. Have a nice day. Goodbye.